Welcome. Let's talk about the if statement. We finally get to see the selection programming structure in action, meaning we're going to learn how we code the selection programming structure. But before we do that, let us think of this programming structure in a different way. What we have been saying is that we do some form of steps, right? And then we come to a decision, and then we evaluate some conditions. If the conditions come out to be true, then we take the true path. If it's false, then we take the false path. And depending on the path we take, we do the following steps that are within that path. Once that path is complete, they merge back together, and then we continue on with whatever we're doing. So what I want us to do is, instead of thinking of once I evaluate my condition, I'm either going to take one path or another. What I instead want to think of is, I'm going to evaluate a condition. If the condition is true, I am going to add steps to my work. If it's false, then I'm not going to add steps. In other words, I want for us to look at the selection programming instruction as follows. These two might look very different, but essentially they're the same thing. For both of them, we have a decision, right? So here we have a decision on the right and a decision on the left. The decision that we make is based on some condition that yields a Boolean value, right? And we have two paths. We have the true path, which is right here, our first path. And then we have the false path, which is down here. For the other one, it's on the left side. Now, the only difference is that on the graph on the right, notice that the true path actually has some instructions that we have to follow. Whereas the false path, there is nothing, right? So think of it as one path is completely empty and the other one has some work for us to do. So even though they're the same thing, conceptually we can think of them a little bit different. In one, we evaluate a condition and we take one path or the other. In the other one, we evaluate the condition and we either decide to add some steps right here or add no steps at all. What we're going to learn how to code is we're going to learn how to do this thing on the right that we have here. How do we define some code that only runs when the condition is true? And when it's not true, then we do not add anything else. And that's where the if statement comes in. Here we are where we left off last time. So we had done some work with multiple conditions. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all of this, right? And this is something that we had talked about in one of the videos where we did an example. So we'll take some use of it. So if you want to know what we did here, I'll leave a note so you guys can go take a look at that. But we basically wrote some code that help us determine whether we should wear a sweater today based on the temperature and based on whether we had a sweater in our closet or not. All right, so back to the if statement. So what we want to do here is we want to be able to define some piece of code that only runs when some condition is true and it doesn't run when that condition is false. To do so, we have to be able to define this code in such a way that we can think about it turning it off and then turning it on, right? We turn it on when the condition is true. We turn it off when the condition is false. So we have to be able to separate that code. We have to be able to grab that code and say, look, all this code is together and that one runs when this condition is true or it doesn't when it's false. Now, we talked about something that allows us to kind of put code together, kind of to segregate it and put it by itself or isolate it or bundle it together. And that was the concept of scopes. So I also leave a note here. So if you haven't looked at that video, I really strongly suggest for you to look at the scopes video, because everything that applies to scopes, everything also applies to what we're going to do here. So we're going to define a scope. I'm going to do a little scope here, right? Open and close curly braces. And basically what I want to do here is everything that I want it to run when the condition is true, it has to go here. So I'm going to put a comment that says code for when condition is true goes here, right? Everything that we do will go there. Now, to talk about it in the context of an example, here we have a variable that says wear sweater, right? This variable will tell us when we should wear a sweater and when we should not wear a sweater. So what I'm going to do is, in here, what we're going to do is we're going to ask the question, should I wear a sweater? And if the condition is true, then I'm going to put on a sweater. If the condition is false, then I do not put on a sweater, right? I skip that step of putting on my sweater. So in here, the code that will run when my condition is true is going to be just going to be a message that says, puts on sweater, right? It's just a simple message that would say I'm putting on my sweater. And then out here, instead of printing out a result and such, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say goes out the door, right? So If the condition is true, we put on a sweater, then we go out the door. If the condition is false, then we do not put on a sweater and we just straight go to leave the house, right? Now, if we do this, if we run it like this, every time we're going to wear a sweater, right? Because the scope itself, it just isolates the code. But we haven't done the question. We haven't done that little diamond that we have in our design. We have not put that diamond there. This thing that we have here is those extra steps that we added as part of this decision making on the true path. So now we have to add the diamond. The diamond, in a way, is put in our code by using the keyword if. Every time that you want to make a question or a decision, for example, for our selection programming structure, when you want to make a question, we have to use the word if. And if you think about it, the word if in itself is a question. So what I want to do here is right before my scope, I will say if, right? And now this has created a diamond. If you want to think about it in a pictorial way, this if keyword has created a diamond. Now, within this diamond, we had to put some conditions, right? We have to evaluate some conditions and supply with a Boolean value. So we need to be able to put some condition here. To put the condition inside this diamond, inside this if, we have to use parentheses. So we do open and close parentheses. And then inside this parentheses, we're going to put the condition that we want to be evaluated. That if it is true, we will run this piece of code. If it's false, then it skips it and it just goes down here, right? So my condition here is if I need to wear a sweater, right? And that value can be obtained from the question or from the Boolean variable wear sweater. So I can say if wear sweater, then I'm going to put on the sweater. And then if it's false, I skip this, I don't do this. But regardless of whether it's true or false, I'm going to come down here and then go out the door, right? So in this code that we have here, when we have to wear a sweater, we will put on the sweater, right? So this is the logic that we run to determine whether we should wear a sweater or not. But then this is the logic of what do we do once we find out that we have to wear a sweater. So in here, let's take a look at some of the values that we have. So temperature is 50. 50 is not less than the cold threshold, right? We need it to be less than the cold threshold. So let's change this temperature to 40. Let's say it's 40 degrees outside. So now it's cold. We know that. We have 5 sweaters, and the number of sweaters is greater than 0. So we do have a sweater. So when we do is it cold and have a sweater, they're both true. So true and true, that's going to be true. So we are going to wear a sweater. So this is going to be true. So if we have to wear a sweater, then we put on the sweater. So when we run this, we should be able to get puts on sweater followed by goes out the door. So we run this, and what do we get? Once we run this, I'm going to put this on the side. You will see puts on sweater, right? That's this part right here. And then followed by goes out the door, right? So we were able to, again, run this piece of code that's inside this scope. Now let's show what happens when wear sweater is false. So I'm going to come up here, and I'm going to return this back to 50, right? So now the temperature is 50 degrees, meaning it's not cold, meaning this is false, and false and true will yield a false, and therefore this will be a false. So let's run this, and now we should only get goes out the door. So we have successfully skipped this code by simply looking at this condition. And this is how we now have decisions in our code. Mainly, what we have is we have the ability to add a section of code to our workflow. So if you imagine this, everything that goes here, this is our workflow, right? We are able to add this piece of code to our workflow only when a condition is true, namely wear sweater. And when it's not true, then we do not add this code to our workflow. And that's it. This is how the if statement works. This is the selection programming structure, part of it, right? Before we had right path, left path, we modified the design to we add some code only when it's true, otherwise we do not add code. But either way, we have 2 paths. One path is we add code, the other path is we do not. And so we still have to figure out, well, what happens if we want to add some code when the condition is true, but we might want to add a separate amount of code when the condition is false. And that we will talk about in the next video. before we wrap up this video, let's talk about a few rules that affect the if statement, so you be aware of when you start writing some if statements, or if you come across some of these if statements that might look a little bit different. So first of all, what we put inside of this parenthesis, we're not limited to just putting one variable in there. We can put a whole lot of mess inside this parenthesis. So for example, in here we have wear a sweater, right? Well, I can go and I can copy all of this, because wear a sweater is equal to is it cold and have a sweater. So I can just grab this and I can paste it here, all right? And this will completely work, right? Puts on sweater, goes out the door. Okay, how can I make this even more messier? Well, is it cold is what? Temperature less than threshold. So I can copy this and I can put this here. And then what is another thing? Well, have sweater is number of sweaters is greater than 0. So I can definitely put that here, right? And I can delete this code, I can delete this condition, I can delete this condition, right? And if I run this, it's completely fine, right? So you can put any weird conditional operation in here. You can make this as long as you want, and it will still work. It is completely okay. When would you do one versus the other? When would you do something like this versus just having the simple variable? Well, it depends. If you feel like having it organized, like figuring out what the Boolean operation is before you get to the if statement, if you feel like that's more clean for your code, then you do that. If you feel like the conditional operation that you have here is easy to understand, like for example, if we look at this is not very complicated to understand. If the temperature is less than our cold threshold, okay, if it's feeling cold, and we have a sweater because the number of sweaters is greater than 0, then we can wear a sweater. Okay, I can understand what's inside of this parentheses just by looking at this conditional operation, and it's fine, right? So just be aware that you can put here anything, as long as at the end of the day, as long as whatever this operation results to a Boolean value, right? Which means I could even put a Boolean value. I can just come here and I can say true. Now, of course, this it's like me giving you a decision that only has the true option. You cannot say false, right? So it doesn't really feel like a decision if you have to always do it. It doesn't really feel like a decision. So in this case, you don't really see if true or if false, because if true, well, I just remove this, right? That's the same thing. So there's no point in having it. However, you could put if true, right? If I run it, there it is, right? And if I come here and I put false, no big deal, it'll still work, right? I don't have to put on a sweater now. So again, you can put anything so long as at the end of the day, the value in there becomes a Boolean value. Which means also, remember when we talked about mixing data types, I can put a number here, right? The number 5 is an integer, which gets converted to Boolean to a true, right? We talked about that in the mixing data types. I'll leave a note if you want to take a look at that. But here, if 5, well, 5 is a true. And if I put a 0, well, 0 is a false, right? And here we go, it's gone. So as long as whatever you put here, at the end of the day, becomes a Boolean value, you can put whatever you want. Now, the other thing, let me put this back to where we have it. The other thing we have to talk about is the scope itself. The scope has to follow the if statement. So the if statement is this thing, the if with its parentheses. The scope has to follow that. You cannot have anything between the scope and the if statement. Otherwise, C++ won't know that the scope is connected to the if statement. How it knows is because it's right afterwards. So here's the scope, here's the if statement. That means if I come and I try to put some code here, if I say int x is equal to 5 plus 3, let's just say, I have broken that. C++ won't know that this scope should run only when this is true, right? So you cannot put code in between the if statement and the curly braces. Now, so don't do that, right? It doesn't really make much sense to put code in between, but just in case, if you see that, don't do that. The second thing is that you do not have to have a scope. Well, you do, but if you don't have a scope, things still work. So for example, I can remove this scope. I'm gonna remove the comment, and I can remove this scope. This is a completely valid if statement. I can run this, and it works. Now, the problem here is that, well, it's not really a problem. It comes down to when should you use a scope and when should you not. Because in here, whether I have a scope, let me put it right here, and let's put the other one right here, right? Okay, yeah, there you go, right here. Whether I have that or that, it makes no difference. It's completely the same thing, right? Why would you want to use a scope versus not a scope? Well, I advise you to always use a scope. As a rule of thumb, always use it. Why? Because it'll avoid you making mistakes in the future that you don't want to make. And I'll tell you what I mean. But I always put them because it's a good thing to have them. There's one time when you do not need scopes, and that's only when you have one statement inside of the if condition. So when I use the word inside of the if statement, I'm talking about this, right? This is inside the if statement, meaning this has to be true, right, for this thing to run. So this is the inside of the if statement. So when I use the word inside, I'm talking about what's inside of the scope that is part of my if statement. When I say outside, well, I'm talking about anything outside the if statement, right, the outer part. So what I'm trying to say is when the inside of the if statement is only one line of code, like this one right here, if it's only one line of code, only one statement, only one semicolon, then you can omit the scope. That's completely fine, right? But when you have multiple lines of code, then you need the scope. Otherwise, it will not work. Let me show you an example. So if I put here printf, let's say it's very cold. I'm going to put 2 sweaters. Puts on second sweater, right? So if it's cold and I run this, puts on sweater, here you go, puts on second sweater, and then, goes out the door, right? Okay, now let's remove the curly braces. I'm going to remove this. I'm going to remove this. Now, I'm going to run it. It's going to work. Spoiler alert, it's going to work. Puts on sweater, puts on second sweater, goes out the door. You might say, okay, it works. What's the big deal? Let's make it not cold. I'm going to change this to 50 degrees, right? So now this is going to be false, which means that these 2 lines of code should not run. Let's run it. Puts on second sweater. This line of code is not inside of our if statement. The only line of code inside of our if statement, it's the first one. By default, this is how C++ work. When you do not put a scope, only the first statement following the if statement is part of the body, is part of the inside of the if statement. The rest of them are not. When you use a scope, then the entirety of the scope is part of the if statement. So if now I can fix this by putting my famous curly braces and like this, and I run this, and so now I just go out the door. Now I successfully get rid of this. So by rule of thumb, always use the scopes. But if you do happen to see a time where there is no scopes, mainly because perhaps the decision that you're writing in your code really only has one line of code that it affects it. Like you say, if this is true, I want to do one line of code, right? That's completely okay. However, in my years of experience as a programmer, you sometimes come back and edit code. You want to squeeze in lines of code. And if you forget to put the curly brace and you do something like this, once you run it and you're like, why is this not being shown? Or why is this being shown even though this is in the if statement? Well, the reason is because only the first one works, not the second one. So save yourself some trouble. Always put the scopes. And the last thing to talk about is this curly brace. This is mostly preference. I don't like to have this curly brace right here in a new line. I like to have it at the end of the if statement right here. And I talked about this in another video where we talked about some of the preferences when we're coding. I like to have my curly braces in front of the statement. So here we go. If this is my if statement, I want to have the opening curly brace at the end of it. I don't want to have it on a new line. Some people like to have it like this. It's completely fine. There's no difference. Absolutely no difference. It's mainly programmer preference, but I prefer to have it like this. So for all my videos, I will have the curly brace in the front. I suggest you do it too. However, if for some reason you're like, no, that looks more elegant, then you go ahead and adapt that. It's completely okay. Okay, so now we know how to incorporate decisions. But this incorporation that I show you, the if statement, only takes the right side or the true path of our selection programming structure, right? And we had to change the way we think about the selection programming structure. We had to think about, instead of taking left and right path, I think about, do I add extra work or do I not? In the next video, we're actually going to learn this. Do I take the right path or do I take the left path? Or do I add this amount of work to my workflow or do I add this other work to my workflow? So we'll talk about the other branch of our selection programming structure in the next video. If you found this video useful and you don't mind, make sure you leave a like. If you have a question, if there's something that wasn't very clear, feel free to leave a comment below. If you're new to this channel, check out the series, check out the channel. And if you like what you see, subscribe. Be safe and peace out.